The morning her grandfather sharpened his knife, Maisie already knew what it was for. She had seen that knife before, once, on a lamb that hadn't made it through winter. That lamb had been smaller than this one. That lamb hadn't had a name yet. This one had a name. She stood in the doorway of the barn with the cold morning pressing against her back and watched Harlan draw the blade slowly across the whetstone, back and forth, back and forth. The sound of it a low whisper that seemed to fill the whole barn. He didn't look up. He never looked up when he was doing something that needed doing. That was how Maisie had learned to read him over the years. Not by his face, but by the angle of his shoulders, the way his jaw set when something was decided. And his jaw was set now. She looked at the small pen in the corner. Pip was standing at the gate with his front hooves on the lowest rail, watching her the way he always did when she came in, his round dark eyes catching what little light came through the slats, his tail moving in that quick, ridiculous way that had made her laugh since the first week of his life. He was 3 months old. She had fed him with a bottle for the first 6 weeks because his mother had refused him. She had sat in this same barn in the dark November, cold with Pip curled against her leg, holding the bottle at the angle the veterinarian had shown her, feeling his small mouth pull and pull. She had named him on the 4th day, which her grandfather had told her not to do. Now she understood why he had said that. She crossed the barn without a word and put both hands on the gate rail on either side of Pip's face and looked at him directly. He made a soft sound, one she had catalogued and sorted across 93 days. This one was the sound he made when he was content, when he did not know anything was wrong. She had to swallow twice before she could breathe normally again. Then she made a decision. She did not think about it the way adults think about decisions, weighing consequences and calculating odds. She was 8 years old. She thought about it the way a child thinks. This is wrong and I am going to fix it. And she did not see any other option. She waited until her grandfather went inside for breakfast. She had 12 minutes. She had timed it before, on other mornings, when she was doing things she needed privacy for. She lifted the latch, took Pip by his canvas halter, the one she had oiled herself with a tin of neat's foot oil she'd found in the tack room, and she walked him out of the barn, across the yard, past the broken fence post that Harlan had been meaning to repair since September, and into the woods at the far edge of the property. She did not look back. What happened in those first hours was something Maisie would not be able to explain fully. Even years later, when she was old enough to have the words for it, she found a shallow depression in the earth, beneath a cluster of old oaks, hidden from the main field by a long slope of land that bent just enough to make it invisible from the house. She had found this place 2 summers before, on an afternoon when she had been trying to get far enough from the farmhouse that she couldn't hear the sound of the phone calls. Her grandfather was making the long, low conversations about debt and banks and things she didn't understand, but could feel pressing down on the house like weather. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. She had never told Harlan about it. She tied Pip's lead to a low oak branch with the knot her grandfather had taught her, the one that could be released with a single pull, but wouldn't come loose on its own. She pulled a handful of the dried corn she had taken from the feed bin and held it out on her flat palm. He ate it slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. She sat down in the leaves beside him and put her hand on his back. She could not have articulated what she was asking for in that moment. She was not the kind of child who prayed out loud or made explicit bargains with anything larger than herself. But she sat there with her hand on the lamb's warm back, and she stayed very still, the way her mother had taught her to stay still when you needed to think. And she thought about what she was going to do next. Harlan noticed Pip was gone at 11 that morning. He stood in the barn for a long moment, looking at the empty pen with the expression Maisie had come to associate with him finding something broken that he hadn't broken himself. His hands hung at his sides. He did not call for Maisie right away. He walked around the pen once, checked the latch, looked at the ground, and then walked to the house. She was at the kitchen table doing her schoolwork when he came in. She could feel him looking at her before she looked up. When she did, his eyes were doing that thing she couldn't read, something between tired and something else. He said, "Pip is gone," she said. "I know." He stood very still. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, A crow called once, and then was quiet. He did not ask her where the lamb was. She did not tell him. They held that silence between them like two people holding opposite ends of something heavy and neither willing to set their end down first. Harlan sat down across from her. He put both hands on the table, palms down, the way he did when he was not going to raise his voice. She had learned that this was actually the version of him that meant he was the most serious. He said, "Do you know why I was going to do what I was going to do?" She said, "Money." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "How much money?" He said a number. She did not know exactly what the number meant, but she could hear what it weighed. She said, "Is it enough to lose the farm?" And the way he didn't answer was itself an answer. This was when Maisie learned something that most people do not learn until they are much older, that adults sometimes make the decisions they make, not because they want to, but because they have run out of other decisions. And that running out of decisions is its own kind of grief, different from the grief of losing something you loved, but in the same family. She did not give Pip back that day, or the day after. Harlan did not ask again. This was either because he trusted her, or because he had made some kind of private accommodation with himself that she did not fully understand. He fed the animals, he drove to town on Tuesday for supplies, and came back quieter than when he had left. He sat on the porch in the evenings with his coffee going cold and looked at the field. Maisie watched him from the window. She had been watching him that way for 2 years, since her mother. She had learned to read the farm's emotional weather through Harlan, the same way she read actual weather through the sky. The specific shade of his silence. That meant grief. Versus the shade that meant worry, versus the shade that meant he was calculating something he didn't want to say out loud. He was not a man who spoke about internal states. He had grown up in a time and in a place where men spoke about tasks and problems and the price of things. And the interior life was kept interior with the same discipline one applied to any other form of discipline. But Maisie was a watcher. She had always been. Her mother had called it her superpower. The particular stillness she could achieve. The way she absorbed more information through silence than most people extracted through conversation. "Sit still and let things come to you," her mother used to say, and she had said it as a piece of practical wisdom, not a metaphor, because she had believed in it as practical wisdom. And Maisie had believed her. So she watched Harlan on the porch each evening, the way he looked at the field, and she thought about what was in his face. It was not despair exactly. Harlan was not a man who went to despair easily. It was something more specific than that. Something she had no name for yet, but which she recognized the shape of. It was the expression of a man who has done everything right and arrived somewhere wrong anyway, and who is trying to locate the point where doing everything right had stopped being enough. She had seen the farm account books once, by accident, left open on the kitchen table. She hadn't understood the numbers in detail, but she had understood the shape of them. The way the column on the right side was shorter than the column on the left side in a way that didn't correct itself, no matter how far down the page you went. The farm had not always been this way. She knew that from pieces of conversation she had collected over years, fragments her grandfather had let slip when he didn't realize she was listening. The farm had been solvent once. Productive. It had sold wool and sold lamb and sold a few head of cattle, and the orchard at the north end had yielded enough in good years to make the difference. Then the cattle market changed. Then the orchard had a bad decade, 3 consecutive late frosts, wiping out the blossoms before they could set, and the old trees that her great-great-grandfather had planted had started giving out one by one, going hollow at the core and then falling in high winds, and Harlan had not had the capital to replant. Then the wool prices changed. Then the heating system in the farmhouse had needed full replacement, and the barn roof had needed partial replacement, and the equipment had needed repairs that kept accumulating the way repairs always did. Each one solved, and 2 more appearing behind it. And then her mother had died, and Harlan had been left not just with the grief, and not just with Maisie, but with the administrative reality of a farm that had been running. In part of her mother's income from her part-time work at the veterinarian's office in town, work she had taken specifically to help close the gap. That income was gone. The gap had widened. He had not told Maisie any of this directly. She had assembled it from the pieces that reached her. the way you assemble a picture from what is visible around the frame of a closed door. She was watching, too, for something else. She had started noticing it on the second day, when she went back to the oak grove to feed Pip and check his water. He was not where she had tied him. Not far. Not far. The lead rope had pulled taut and then gone slack again, and he had moved as far as the rope would allow in one particular direction, toward the center of the field. And he was standing there, straining against it in a way she had never seen him strain. His nostrils were flared. His ears were rotating forward in the constant scanning motion. That meant he was trying to locate a sound or a scent. His hooves kept moving in a small, restless pattern. Not pacing, but searching, like he was trying to dig through the ground with his feet. She stood at the edge of the grove and watched him for a full minute before she moved. She had spent 3 months learning his patterns. She knew the sound he made when he wanted water and the different sound he made when he wanted company. She knew the head toss that preceded his running, which he did sometimes in the yard in the early morning, for no apparent reason, simply because he was young, and the cold air was interesting. She knew the stillness he achieved when he was frightened. A freezing in place that she had initially mistaken for calm but had come to understand was its opposite. This was not any of those things. This was something she did not have a category for. He was oriented in a specific direction with a specificity that felt intentional, the way a compass needle is intentional. And he had been there for some time, long enough to have worn the frost off the patch of ground under his hooves. The lead rope was taut in a straight line, pointing at the far edge of the field, where the old equipment lay half-buried and rusting. She walked to him and put her hand on his side. His ribs were moving fast. She looked in the direction he was pointing. The field was just the field, brown and dead in December, the old furrows still visible from the last planting season, the ground hard with cold, a stand of dead goldenrod at the far fence line, an old rusted section of pipe half buried at the edge, one of several pieces of old equipment her grandfather had said predated him on this land, things from before. She looked at the pipe. She looked back at Pip. He made a sound she had not heard before. She told herself she was imagining things. She was 8 years old, and she had watched many nature documentaries, and she was letting herself see something that wasn't there. But she stayed beside him for an hour that afternoon, and the whole time, his attention never moved from that far corner of the field. It was absolute. It was the way her grandfather looked at something when he was trying to understand it, the kind of looking that used the whole face. She came back on the morning of the third day, and he was doing it again. She gave him extra time that morning, unhooking the lead and letting him move freely within the grove, and he went immediately in the same direction, to the edge of the tree line where it opened onto the field, and stood at the boundary looking out. She watched him from behind, his ears forward, his whole small body aimed at the far corner like an arrow at rest. She thought about what her grandfather had said once, about animals and property. He had said it in reference to the farm dogs they'd had when she was small. A cattle dog named Brig who had walked the fence line every single morning without being told. He had said, "Some animals know where they belong in a way people have to be taught." He had said it admiringly. She had stored it. She looked at Pip at the edge of the tree line. She did not know what he knew. She knew what he was doing. That night at dinner, she asked Harlan about the old things in the field. He looked at her over his soup. She said, "The pieces of metal and equipment on the far side. How old are they?" He said, "Some of them went back to his father's time. Maybe before that, his father had left them there because moving scrap metal cost money and they were not in the way of anything. His grandfather," he said, "had buried things when he didn't want to pay to haul them off either." That was a different era. People buried what they couldn't carry, Maisie said. "What do you bury?" Harlan shrugged. He said he didn't know exactly. Old tins, equipment. Probably nothing worth looking for, she said. Did he bury anything in the far corner? Past the old pipe section. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. He said, "Why?" She said, "Pip keeps looking at it." Harlan set down his spoon. He said, "Pip keeps looking at a piece of field." She said, "Every time I take him there." Since yesterday, he said nothing. He picked up his spoon again. He finished his soup. He put the bowl in the sink, and he went to the porch, and she could hear him out there for a long time. She understood that she had said something that meant something, but she didn't know what. What she did not know, sitting at that kitchen table, was that Harlan was standing on the porch doing something she had never seen him do before. She would only find out about it years later. He was trying to remember. There was a reason no one had told Maisie the full history of the farm. It was not malice, it was the kind of protective silence that grief builds around itself. The way scar tissue forms not to hide the wound, but because that is what the body does when it is trying to go on. The farm had been in Harlan's family for 3 generations. His grandfather, a man named Everett, had come to this county as a young man with almost nothing, had worked other people's land for 7 years, and had eventually bought this parcel with money that had taken him a decade to save and borrow. He had built the original farmhouse with his hands. He had planted the first orchard, the remnants of which were still visible in the warped old trees at the north edge of the property. Everett had been, by all accounts, a man who trusted almost no one but his own 2 hands. He had kept money in the house rather than in banks. He had kept documents in the house too. Important documents, deeds and receipts and contracts, in a metal box that his wife had described as being about the size of a hardcover Bible, painted green, sealed with a simple latch. When Everett died in his 70s, the box could not be found. His wife had assumed he had buried it. She had said this to Harlan's father, once, in passing, as the kind of thing old people say about other old people. That sounds like a joke but might not be. She had said, "You know how your father was. He probably buried it. He probably thought the bank was going to come onto the property and take it." They had laughed. Neither of them had looked. Harlan had been 17 when that conversation happened. He had not thought about it again for 40 years. He thought about it now. He stood on the porch in the cold, his breath showing in the dark, and he thought about Pip in the far corner of the field, pointing at something in the ground. He thought about his grandfather, who had been a man who buried what he couldn't carry. He thought about the legal papers that had arrived 6 weeks ago from the county, the ones he had put in the kitchen drawer and not opened a second time because opening them a second time made them more real. The papers filed by his neighbor Corbin, who had a lawyer in the city, and documents of his own, documents that claimed a portion of this property had never been properly transferred, had never been Everett's to deed forward. Corbin had been circling the farm for 2 years. He had made 3 offers to buy it. Each one declined. The legal papers were the next step. His lawyer had argued there was a gap in the deed chain, a missing link that put the legitimacy of Harlan's ownership in question. Harlan had his own lawyer, a man in town who was not expensive but was not hopeful. He had said, "If you can't produce documentation of continuous ownership going back to the original transfer, Corbin's claim has something to stand on." And Harlan had said, "Where am I supposed to find documentation from 70 years ago?" And the lawyer had said, "That's the problem." That had been 4 weeks ago. On the morning of the 3rd day, after Maisie hid Pip in the oak grove, she watched her grandfather pull on his work boots at the kitchen door and walk toward the far field alone. Without his usual tools, carrying only a shovel and a long metal rod he used sometimes to check irrigation lines, she followed at a distance. He walked the field the way a man walks when he is looking for something he does not expect to find. Slowly, stopping, looking at the ground. He was not following Pip's line of sight, not exactly, because he did not know exactly where Pip had been pointing. He was working from memory, from a 40-year-old fragment of conversation he was not even fully sure he had heard correctly. Maisie watched from the edge of the oak grove. Then she made a decision. She untied Pip, took his lead, and walked him out into the field. Harlan turned when he heard them. He looked at the lamb and then at his granddaughter and said nothing. She walked Pip into the field and let him lead. This was something she had noticed on the 2nd day. If she gave him slack in the lead and walked beside him without pulling, he went in a specific direction, not wandering specific. She had let him do it twice already, just to see, and both times he had ended up in the same place, the same patch of ground near the old pipe section, his hooves doing that restless searching motion. Ediditna. She watched Harlan watching the lamb. Pip stopped. He pawed at the ground 4 times. He lowered his nose and held it there. Harlan took a long breath. He walked to where the lamb was standing, crouched it down, and pressed the metal rod into the ground. It hit resistance after 8 inches. He moved it 6 inches to the left. Hit resistance again. He moved it twice more and hit it again. He stood up and looked at Maisie. She could not read his face. He said, "Go to the house." She said, "No." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "All right." He started to dig. The ground was cold and hard, and it took him a long time. Maisie stood with Pip beside her and watched. The crow was back somewhere in the oaks, calling in its flat, repetitive way. The morning was completely still otherwise. She could hear the sound of the shovel, the way it changed when the dirt got looser, the different register of it against the frozen surface versus the softer ground below. 20 minutes in, he hit metal. He did not say anything. He cleared the dirt from around the edges with the blade of the shovel and then with his gloved hands. Maisie came closer. She could see the outline of a box, rectangular, about the size of a large book. Its surface a dark and mottled green beneath the dirt. A latch on one side gone to rust. Harlan sat back on his heels. He was silent for a very long time. Then he said, "My grandfather buried this." He said it quietly, not to her. Exactly. More the way people say things. They need to hear out loud in order to believe. He picked up the box, stood, and carried it to the house. Maisie walked beside him. Pip followed at the end of his lead without any tension. Calm now, completely calm, as if whatever urgency had been in him for 3 days had finished its work. At the kitchen table, Harlan set the box down and looked at it. The latch was rusted through, but the box itself had held. He worked a screwdriver under the lid while Maisie sat across from him. The metal groaned and then gave. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had done its job remarkably well, were papers. Not just any papers. Deeds. Original land deeds. A transferred document signed by the county land office in a year that made Harlan put his finger on it and count forward from it. A receipt. A receipt. 2 letters. And at the bottom, a handwritten note in a cramped and careful script that Harlan stared at for a long time without speaking. The deed chain was there. All of it, the original purchase, the transfer to his father, the clear and unbroken line of ownership in black ink that was dry and faded and entirely, completely legible. Harlan put both hands flat on the table. Maisie did not understand all of what she was looking at, but she understood what she saw on her grandfather's face. She had not seen that particular expression before, and she would spend years afterward trying to name it properly. It was not just relief, though relief was part of it. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time, and had just been allowed to set it down. It was the expression of someone discovering that the thing they had almost given up on had been there the whole time. Patient, waiting in the dark. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Let. He put his other hand over hers, both of his around one of hers, and they sat that way while the morning light moved across the table. What happened next was not immediate. These things never are, Harlan called his lawyer that afternoon. The lawyer drove out 2 days later and sat at the same kitchen table and looked at the documents with his reading glasses low on his nose, going very quiet in the way that lawyers go quiet when something has shifted decisively in a direction they did not anticipate. He asked where these had been found. Harlan said in the ground. The lawyer looked at him. Harlan said, "My granddaughter's lamb found them." The lawyer looked at Maisie. She did not look away. The documents were authenticated over the following weeks. The deed chain was complete. The county land office confirmed the paperwork was consistent with records from the period, the signatures matching archived signatures on other documents from the same era. Corbin's lawyer sent a letter in early January and then did not send another one after that. The farm was Harlan's, had always been Harlan's. Would remain Harlan's? Pip stayed. This did not need to be said out loud. Harlan never mentioned the knife again, and Maisie never brought it up, and there is a kind of grace in the silences that two people build around things they have both understood without speaking, a grace that is different from the silence of avoidance, and more like the silence of agreed peace. Pip grew, not in the dramatic way of animals in stories, not into something massive and imposing. He grew the way real animals grow, steadily and unglamorously, into a sturdy and cheerful presence in the farm's daily life. He had the run of the yard by spring, and by summer he had developed the particular habit of following Maisie's grandfather around during morning chores in a way that made Harlan pretend he hadn't noticed. Maisie noticed. She said nothing. There was a night in March when Harlan told her about her mother. Not the first telling, not the facts, which Maisie knew. Her mother had been gone for 2.5 years. She had died in a way that was not dramatic, but was not gentle either. A thing that had happened too fast for anyone to prepare for, and had left its shape in every room of the farmhouse. What he told her was the other part. The part about the farm. Her mother, he said, had loved this land the way some people love a thing that is not land. She had grown up on it, had left it for years, had come back to it when Maisie was born, because she said she wanted Maisie to grow up knowing what it felt like to have a place that was hers. Not a house. A place. She used to walk the fields in the evenings the way Harlan did sometimes, not doing anything, just being in it. He said, she used to take you to the far corner, that one with the old pipey. You were 2. Maybe 3. She said there was something about that spot. Something she liked. Maisie was very still. She said, she took me there. He said, you used to try to dig in the dirt. She thought it was funny. She used to say, you must be looking for treasure. He stopped talking. Outside the window, the dark was complete, and the stars were very clear. Maisie thought about the corner of the field, the way Pip's nose had pressed into the earth, his hooves searching. She thought about 2 years old and her mother's hands and a spot of ground that something in her body had never forgotten. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, Pip knew. Harlan looked at her. She could tell he wanted to give her the reasonable answer, the one about animal senses and scent, and the way metal interacts with soil chemistry in ways that animals can sometimes detect. She had looked some of this up herself. She knew about the studies, the research into how certain animals can perceive buried metals, how electromagnetic variations in the ground can produce behavioral responses in livestock. She was 8, but she was not uninformed. She also knew that none of that explained all of it. Harlan said, I don't know what Pip knew. He said it slowly, which was his way of saying he meant it exactly. He said, but I know what he did. That was enough for both of them. Years later, when Maisie was 16, and then 20, and then old enough to tell this story, at the kind of gatherings where people tell stories, she always told it straight. She did not embellish the parts that did not need embellishing, and she did not diminish the parts that people sometimes expected her to explain away. She said, my grandfather was going to sell the lamb because we were out of money. I hid him. 3 days later, he found something in the ground that saved the farm. She let people ask their questions, and she answered the ones she could. The question she could never answer fully was the one people always asked last. They wanted to know if she thought the lamb had known. Really known. If there was something in him that understood what was at stake, or what was there, or what the ground held, she would pause before that question. Always. The pause was not hesitation. It was respect for the weight of the thing. Then she would say, I know what I saw. She would say, I know what he did. And then she would say the thing that closed it. The thing she had arrived at over years of carrying the memory. Whatever Pip knew or didn't know, whatever the explanation is for what he found, the only reason any of it happened was because he was there. And he was there because I wouldn't let him go. She would let that sit. She did not need to add anything to it. The people listening always understood. The farm is still there. The oak grove is still at the edge of the property. The depression in the earth still visible if you know where to look. The old pipe section is still rusting slowly at the far corner of the field. The hole Harlan dug is long since filled in. The earth over it is indistinguishable from any other part of the field. Maisie knows where it is. She goes there sometimes, not for any specific reason. She just goes and stands there and looks at the ground. And sometimes she stays for a while, and sometimes she doesn't stay long. And the field is just a field. And whatever it holds now is only what fields hold. And the thing that matters is not what was buried there, But what was found? Pip is old now. Older than most sheep get, which is a fact that the veterinarian has mentioned more than once, with an expression that suggests he considers this a minor medical curiosity worth noting. He moves slowly, and he sleeps in the sun, and he does not follow anyone around the way he used to. He still comes to Maisie, not every day, not on any schedule she has been able to predict, but Ekomis. He walks to wherever she is and stands beside her, and she puts her hand on his back, the way she did in the oak grove on that first morning, when she was 8 years old and she had made a decision that she did not know was a decision, and she stays very still, the way her mother taught her. When the stillness is enough.